Welcome back as we say hello to my next guest, Luke Jones, who's broadcasting from truly parts unknown based on his background. I'm afraid to ask where Luke is today, but Luke, welcome in.
Let's just say, Dennis, it's somewhere where I have internet, which has been an issue at my home. I had, the storm on Monday night, no power for a couple days and
Wow.
no internet for most of the week. So we've had to adjust. I swear I'm not in prison or anything like that. We'll just keep it at parts unknown, though. How's that?
Oh, I would never suggest that a man of high caliber such as yourself would be familiar with the inside of the prison walls. Although the background, it does remind me of my elementary school back in 1976 or so.
Well, I am sitting cross-legged as I'm doing this in a hallway, so
Oh,
that's kind of elementary-esque.
there you
But
go.
how are you, Dennis?
I'm
Plenty going
I'm
on this
I'm
week.
I'm doing well and still trying to overcome the shocking loss from the Orioles. That was what Tuesday night that we're watching it and having a great time, and the team's up 6-3, and here comes the big Felix, and oh my goodness gracious, then everything just went haywire.
Yeah, certainly a difficult loss, and certainly one that you're hoping the Orioles can move past this series. As you have a series loss against Houston, and look, even though the Orioles had a better record than the Astros coming into this series, Houston's the defending World Series champion. They've got some guys, and even though that roster's had a little bit of turnover over the last couple of years, though they did bring back Justin Verlander, who the Orioles didn't have to see over the course of this series, but a lot of guys with postseason experience. They know what it takes to be great. And not that I think this series was some defining downfall of the Orioles or anything like that. I mean, they need to regroup on the West Coast and what's a really important road trip for them. But it's a reminder that experience does matter, and the Astros are really good. And that's not to say that the outcome can't be different if these teams meet again come October. But it's a reminder of how difficult it can be. And in the case of Felix Bautista, he's been so good, and I mean, it's going to happen. It was terrible timing, especially when you give up a grand slam when you're up by 3 runs. So it was definitely a difficult one to stomach. And then Wednesday night, they 0 for 7 with runners in scoring position. Fujinami and Mike Baumann struggle in relief. So, it's tough, but teams lose series and teams lose games over the course of 162. And when you're going up against a really good team, that's going to happen sometimes. I think what's important and where I have trust in this ball club is their ability to turn the page and regroup. And anytime they've gone through a brief period where they slide a little bit, and we all remember them losing 6 of 7 in late June into early July, and everyone was panicking at that point, and then they run off a long winning streak after that. So I think that's where the key is for Brandon Hyde's club and these young players. They haven't let those periods where things haven't gone as well. They haven't let that snowball, and that's been the key for them. And that's going to be the key on this road trip as they're facing a red hot Seattle Mariners team, as they go to San Diego against the Padres team that has much to play for and has really been an enigma. You see all the talent, but they've been so disappointing this year. So this is going to be a critical period for them. They're still in first place. No reason to panic, but you want to regroup. You don't want to let a bad series then fester and snowball. And then before
Sure.
you know it, you're talking about having a rough 2 weeks as opposed to a rough 2 days.
Well, for me, Luke, it was just again another stark reminder of one of the major differences between and the NFL and the Major League Baseball is that you just can't run out the clock. You've got to still put the ball over the plate, and anything and everything can and will happen. It also underscored the point of how important defense is, because as bad as Felix Batista was, there were a couple of plays there in that last inning. The drop ball in center field by Mateo, the foul tip that McCann couldn't hold on to, just one pitch here, one out there, and it changes the complexion of the inning and the entire game.
No question about it. And it's something, by and large, the Orioles have done really well this year, which is why they're in the
Yeah.
position that they're in. But it is a reminder because this team plays so many close games, and I best record in the American League in one-run games, or at least as of a couple days ago. But you have to have that sterling defense. You have to be precise, especially in the late innings when you're pitching out of the bullpen. And that's where I think, you and I know, have talked about it. Nestor and I have talked about it, that, that if my big disappointment from the trade deadline was not so much acquiring Jack Flaherty, who was really good his first start and was just okay on Wednesday night, but it was not adding another bullpen arm because, and we saw it again on Wednesday night, Fujinami, it's kind of a coin flip right now. Do you get the good Fuji who looks really, really impressive and has stuff that wows you, or do you get the guy who can't throw strikes? And unfortunately, on Wednesday night, we saw the guy who can't throw strikes. And when you're in that kind of a position where your manager doesn't know what to expect from you, it's really difficult to put him in high leverage situations. So that's where the Orioles are still going to be figuring this out. And we know that they have some guys coming back from injuries who potentially could help, whether it's a reliever like a Michael Givens, or whether we're talking about John Means, who's beginning his rehab assignment. Does he factor into the bullpen? Does Tyler Wells factor into the bullpen? Do those guys go back into the rotation, and then one of the starters factors into another starter factors into the bullpen down the stretch? Point being, feels like they're going to need to, not feels like, they're definitely going to need some incumbents here, some internal options to step up, because the trade deadline's in the rearview mirror at this point. You can't acquire anyone else other than a waiver claim, which, what I'd be remiss if not mentioning that I thought Jacob Webb, who made his Orioles debut on Wednesday night, struck out the side. That was good to see. Now, can he continue doing that, or will he be inconsistent? And, which is part of the reason why he was available to them. So we'll see how it plays out. But we know all year long that this club's margin for error has been small, just with the way that they've played so many close games, and that's okay, right? I mean, ideally, yeah, you'd love to blow teams out every night, but it's difficult to do, especially when you're going up against the best, like the Houston Astros. But I think the key for them is, again, turn the page, put the series behind them, because this is a pretty pivotal West Coast trip for them, not for their playoff chances, but wanting to maintain first place in the AL East with the Tampa Bay Rays still right there, just a couple games behind.
For sure. Jackson Holliday's tearing it up, and any talk about something fun. Any chance at all we see him later in the season? Because by all accounts, he's a real deal. I know he's 19 years old. It's not unheard of course, for a 19-year-old to be in the major leagues, but he seems to be a special young man.
In a vacuum, Dennis, like if you were just telling me this was the story for an unidentified club that was in the position that the Orioles are in right now, with a 19-year-old who is just raking at Double-A, I would say there's a chance. With the Orioles and how they have proceeded and how Mike Elias has handled his prospects, and not to get too much into questions about ownership and recent events and things of that nature, which I know have been discussed at length, but questions there, it doesn't feel like something to me that I would be holding my breath over. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that Jackson Holliday couldn't come up and do it, but I think it is also important to recognize, even though he's an extraordinary talent, he is still only 19, and Double-A is not the same thing as the majors. So what I just laid out is more so the argument that the Orioles would probably give you from a big picture viewpoint. And I think even how they proceeded at the trade deadline, where you didn't see them, they didn't go all in, so to speak, in terms of trading their top prospects for guys that might only be rental players to help them the rest of the way. Put it this way. I don't want to say it's a 0% chance, Dennis.
Understood.
But I would be very, very surprised. However, boy, that would be such a fun scenario, and would certainly conjure memories of the Orioles bringing up Manny Machado, who had just turned 20 in August of 2012. But the scenario was a little different then. The Orioles needed a third baseman, and they weren't really even expecting Manny to swing the bat even as well as he ended up doing that year, which was respectable for a 20-year-old. That was all about defense. I think Wilson Betemit was playing a lot of third base for them at that point. And if anyone remembers Betemit, not a good defensive player, certainly not a Gold Glover. So again, it's fun to just daydream about that. And again, it's a question that has merit. I certainly don't bother you, or doesn't bother me that you brought it up or even suggested it. I think it'd be a heck of a lot of fun, but I just don't see it, knowing the overall profile of how the organization has proceeded the last couple of years in terms of how they view their young prospects and, in terms of pulling the trigger and calling them up to the majors.
Yeah, I thought it'd be a fun topic to bring up.
Yeah.
Given the series thus far against the Astros, the national media piling on the team for other reasons, etc.
Yeah.
I thought I would just shift our attention to that and just think about the possibility of having him up. But for the immediacy, how's Cedric Mullins? Clearly, the Orioles need to get him back on the field.
Yeah, he's wrapping up, or it's expected that he's wrapping up his rehab assignment with Double-A Bowie. And the expectation as of Wednesday, when Brandon Hyde talked about it and was asked about how he was doing, was that he's going to be rejoining the Orioles in Seattle. He's going to travel with them in Seattle, and I would expect him to be activated for the start of the road trip or at the very early stages of the road trip, because it seems like he's ready. He's made a couple sterling defensive plays in the outfield. Hasn't swung the bat overly impressive in terms of the numbers in his few games at Double-A Bowie. But the good news is it looks like he's healthy. He's made a couple great defensive plays. It appears that he's moving well. And certainly the Orioles are going to want to be careful. I would expect Brandon Hyde to be conservative with him. He even alluded to that in some of his comments on Wednesday, that maybe resting Mullins day game after a night game. Maybe early on, maybe he plays center field one day, DHs the next day. I think you want to be really, really careful with him having two different groin injuries, even though still on Wednesday, Hyde was saying that this one was a little bit different than the first one in terms of where he felt it at first, but then it started, kind of, I guess the discomfort was kind of between the quad and the groin. So, I'm not a doctor and I'm not trying to play one on Zoom either, but they certainly want to be careful because we know how important he is to this team and how much better he can make their lineup if he's right in terms of his ability to swing the bat, his ability to play defense in center field, and certainly what he can bring on the bases, which, I think the Orioles would like to run and force the issue a little more. But, their big speed guy is Jorge Mateo, and we've said it over and over and over. The question is, he can't steal first base. So how much can you really utilize his speed when he's not getting on base at a high clip and doesn't warrant everyday playing time at this point? So certainly good news on the Mullins front, but you want to keep your fingers crossed that there's no setbacks, as it appears he's going to make his return to the Orioles lineup.
Well, he's not a doctor, but he is a Deacon Jones, that is. And Luke, I know you got to go soon. Just give me the cutoff sign as I'm talking here when it's your time. But I do want to talk about the Ravens. I really have 5 big things I want to touch on. The streak, right? 23 straight world record, 23 straight preseason victories, and now we have the no good Philadelphia Eagles coming to the stadium Saturday night. J.K. Dobbins hold in. We've got the David Clowney contract offer. Apparently, he's trying to make up his mind. Then we have the Patrick Ricard on the offensive line, maybe, and also the Rashard Bateman sighting. I saw you tweeted out on Wednesday.
Yeah, to start out with the preseason winning streak, I mean, does it mean much? No. I think it's been a reflection, and I've said this every year for as long as the streak has existed now. And part of me would maybe like to see it end at some point because I just feel like it's something we talk about every summer, and that's fine. I mean, it's fake football games; they don't count at the end of the day. But it is a reflection, in all seriousness, of what I think has been a quality back end of the preseason roster that the Orioles have built. We know that the Ravens, have built for years. We know their uncanny ability to find talent among undrafted free agents, and I think that's shown up in those preseason games, specifically in the second half, where I think you look at a lot of those games, they weren't necessarily decided, and then they were decided in the third and fourth quarter. I would say more so on the defensive side of the football. So you have that. I'm trying to think what was next. J.K. Dobbins, I believe, was your second point.
Correct.
Nothing new on that front. John Harbaugh continues to I've called it I would almost equate it to a killing with kindness kind of approach that the Ravens have taken with J.K. Dobbins. Yeah. We know that this is a hold-in. No one's calling it that officially because you really can't, including the team, because at that point the NFL would say, well, why is he on the PUP list? Physically unable to perform is not the same thing as a financial dispute. But John Harbaugh alluded to it and reiterated that the ball's in JK's court. I think we are rapidly approaching over the next 5 to 7 days where, 5 to 10 days where this, maybe the tone shifts if he's still not out there, because then I think you're getting to the point, if you start getting into the third week of August, now you're starting to question, is he going to be in the right football shape? Is he going to be acclimated to a new offense? Is he going to be ready to play at his absolute best? And the last thing the Ravens or J.K. Dobbins want at this point in time is for him to get out there and legitimately pull a hamstring or something like that if he's not, allowing himself enough time to really ramp up his football activities. So nothing new on that front beyond what we've kind of been saying. And as more time goes on, I think the tension does grow there. I think the frustration does grow there, and perhaps the Ravens not being quite as nice publicly about it. So you have that, Jadeveon Clowney. We'll see how this plays out. Part of me wondered at first if this was a play to try to see if they could get the asking price for Kyle Van Noy, to come down a little bit, from what I understand. I mean, from what I understand, there's an offer, but he wants more money, which is kind of what you expect from veteran edge rushers this time of year. But certainly with Justin Houston now being in Carolina and that possibility now being out of the question, Clowney, it was an ugly departure from Cleveland. That's certainly a guy that I think you need to make sure you're comfortable with from a personality standpoint. He's never been a big production guy in terms of the sacks relative to being a first overall pick and all the hype, but he's still a good player, and he's someone that can play the run really well, which I think is kind of an understated part of where they are right now with their edge defenders, especially with Tyus Bowser being still sidelined with the knee issue, where that's a little bit uncertain. So we'll see how it plays out. The reports are that there's an offer out there and he's considering it. So, whether a deal gets done today or whether it's, a little while from now, or if there isn't a match, we've said all along, I mean, they have to add someone. I think that's obvious at this point, especially with the Bowser uncertainty, which, that's something that to me is a little bit of an underrated concern at this point in time, because they've been kind of hush hush about it. And it's a knee, it's a knee, not his Achilles or anything like that. So, there's been some mystery and we haven't heard from him yet. So the Clowney news, we'll see how that plays out. So trying to think, you mentioned Rashad Bateman back at practice. Great to see. I think you want to take it slow with him. Got to be careful that the foot's right. He only did individual his first day. I'm certainly not going to see him in the first preseason game. I don't know if we'll see him in any of the preseason games, quite frankly. I think you want to be really careful with him. We've talked about it at length, going back to the days of Jimmy Smith, those Liz Frank injuries, they can be tough. They can linger. Discomfort can linger with those injuries. Jimmy Smith, I remember, famously said, and this is someone who had an Achilles injury, he said rehabbing his Achilles was a piece of cake. The Liz Frank bothered him for the rest of his career. So that you want to be careful with Bateman and Patrick Ricard. It's pretty good. I remembered all five of them, Dennis, just out of order a little
almost
bit.
in order. I didn't expect you to do in order either. That was the other part.
Yeah. Patrick Ricard. I think this is one of those scenarios where let's wait and see a little bit. I don't want to make any assumptions here. First of all, yes, he moved from the defensive tackle spot when he was a rookie free agent to becoming a fullback and a 4-time Pro Bowl fullback. Yep. That doesn't mean he's necessarily going to be able to play guard at a high level in the NFL, or a high enough level that's going to warrant a permanent position change. But I think what this does reiterate, Dennis, is this isn't Greg Roman's offense anymore. While I think Todd Monken has some use for a tight end, I think it's much more in an H-back kind of capacity where I said tight end, fullback, sorry. Room for a fullback in the same way, but I think it's much more of an H-back capacity where they line up at fullback, but lining up as tight end, as an inline tight end, going in motion, doing a lot of blocking, but being more of a factor as a receiver out of the backfield. So that's where I find this interesting. If you had asked me back in February when the Ravens hired Todd Monken, and that was before we knew that Ricard underwent hip surgery, but I would have almost said at that point in time, I wonder if his best move is to just drop 20 pounds and try to become Nick Boyle.
Yeah.
He, by all accounts, he hasn't done that, and that's not to say he's out of shape, but he's just the same big Patrick Ricard that we remember the last few years. So for him to be working out on the offensive line, it's interesting. I don't think that means his days as a fullback or as an inline tight end are over. I think that, this is, we're still only in the second week of August, so you do have a little bit of time to experiment here. But I find it interesting because, and this is one guy that I'm looking forward to watching in these preseason games. You get the sense that they're a little bit higher on Ben Mason in this offense than they were in the Greg Roman offense. So this team, someone is going to have to be an inline tight end for them. And it's not Mark Andrews. I don't think it's Isaiah Likely. I don't think it's Charlie Kohler. So who is that going to be? You would have assumed it would be a Patrick Ricard, but they have looked at Ben Mason, and I'll even throw out the name Travis Vokalek, who is a rookie free agent, not necessarily suggesting he'll make the 53-man roster, but could he be on the practice squad and he possibly get some elevations as an inline tight end? So there's going to be a need there that they're going to have to fill. And I'm not saying that that's a major role in this offense, but it's a role in this offense, and there's not a clear-cut person to do that if it's not going to be Patrick Ricard. So I just find it to be interesting at this point in time. I don't think it's something to make too much out of, but as it pertains to when he made his return to the field a few days back, it's definitely a story, and it's an interesting story because he's been hanging with the O-line. And, I even took pictures of him, and there's been video of him hitting the sled, lining up as a guard. So something else just to point out, the NFL with their game day rules in terms of players that you can have active on game day, you can have a 48th player active on game day if it is an 8th offensive lineman. So depending on roster flexibility, depending on injuries that you might have in any given week, if Patrick Ricard, quote unquote, qualifies as an offensive lineman, and I almost feel like I'm talking about fantasy football, in terms of talking like a Taysom Hill or someone like that who qualifies as a quarterback and a tight end.
Sure.
But if he qualifies, that could allow them a little extra roster flexibility. So, it's just wanted to throw that point out there as food for thought. Do I think Patrick Ricard's going to be their starting left guard? No, of course not. But it is interesting, and it, again, is a reminder to me that we're not talking about Greg Roman's offense anymore, that's for sure. So, we'll see how that plays out. But, the good thing is Ricard is back on the field. He's not 100% yet in terms of his practice participation, but they're ramping up his activity level now.
Yeah, I mean, Travis Vokalek was who I was looking at. You mentioned Ben Mason prior to Vokalek. Of course, Josh Oliver went to the Vikings, and to me, that's what I was thinking. Are they going to carry 4 tight ends this year? What are they going to do? But I do think it's interesting how they're moving Ricard around, giving him a shadow of offensive line, because I don't know if it's Mason, I don't know if it's Vokalek, and I guess this is why they have preseason games and they'll figure out who's going to be their best fit for their offense.
Yeah, and one last interesting point that I'll throw out there that I just heard this, and this was at the beginning of training camp. I get the sense that Ricard's interested in doing this. This is something that I think he has felt and expressed some interest in. But as I was talking to someone connected to the organization, there was a little bit of a thought of, be careful not to let Ben Mason continue to get so many reps at fullback. So I thought that was interesting. Again, we could see Patrick Ricard back at fullback and playing inline tight end next week. And then this is, what tends to be a lot of stories this time of year, where it's a story for a couple of days and then it's forgotten about, or there could be a little more to it. So I do find it interesting. And again, I thought back in February, if anything, we'd see Patrick Ricard try to make the full switch to an inline tight end, but it's kind of gone the other way, where he has this interest, and certainly the team is at least taking a look at the idea of him at least providing some depth as an offensive lineman, which, again, game day flexibility, if he can handle it, being your third reserve offensive lineman and being a little more equipped to play that position. Heaven forbid you get a couple injuries on the same day, the same game. It's something worth exploring, at least at this early stage of August. I don't think Patrick Ricard's going to forget how to play fullback just because he's practicing on the O-line for a week or two here.
That's a good point, Luke. I know you got to get going, so please tell our listeners all the great stuff you do on WNST, Baltimore Positive, 1570 AM, your blog, your Twitter account, and everything else that you do.
Absolutely. I encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter at WNST. You can follow me personally at Baltimore Luke. Whether I'm live from Owings Mills or live from Oriole Park at Camden Yards, reporting on the Ravens or the Orioles, check out my blog at BaltimorePositive.com, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. My latest 12 Ravens thoughts. Plenty of thoughts on the Orioles as they continue being in first place in the AL East as they start this big West Coast trip. Very important for them as they try to maintain their top spot in the American League. You want to be on the WNSC Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. Whether it is the Ravens potentially signing a Jadeveon Clowney or a Kyle Van Noy or some other veteran player, whether it's the Orioles making a significant roster move or activating Cedric Mullins from the IL, any significant local sports news sent directly to your mobile device via the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford of Baltimore. And of course, anything throughout the week on AM 1570 with Nestor. Ravens interviews from Owings Mills with players and coaches, interviews with Brandon Hyde, Orioles players at Camden Yards. Check out all of that at BaltimorePositive.com in the audio vault.
All right, my friend, always fun, always a pleasure. Looking forward to our next episode. Have fun at the game, at the baseball game, at the football game. I know you'll be covering everything this weekend.
Absolutely. I'm sure we'll be talking about some of those preseason all-stars from the preseason opener next week. I look forward to it, Dennis.
All right, me too. There he goes, Luke Jones here, 1570 AM. Baltimore Positive WNST. We'll take a quick break and come back right after this.